Welcome back to another segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. Today I'm going to be talking about the very last episode from Season 8, the Valediction, when Jim Bob graduates from high school. This episode was written by Claire Whitaker and directed by Harry Harris. Now, Claire Whitaker was married to Rod Peterson, who was also our producer at this point in the series. And together, Rod and Claire wrote a number of episodes for the Waltons. We find out that Corabeth Godsey is going to be the new substitute teacher at the school, and that they've had a number of substitutes over the last few months. Not quite sure why. That isn't explained, but Corabeth is now going to be the new substitute teacher. And so she's preparing for her first day. Nobody knows who is going to be the new substitute teacher. And she arrives. And one of the things that she shares along the way is that in looking over the graduating students' grade point averages, that Jim Bob is actually tied for top grade point average with one of the other students, Roland Piper. And so it's going to come down to their very last science exam, and that will determine who's going to be valedictorian. Now, Jim Bob doesn't really want to be valedictorian, so and at one point, Jeffrey says, "Oh, well, that's your best subject," or Elizabeth does. Anyway, someone says it's your best subject, and Jim Bob's sort of like, "Okay, well, all I have to do then is fail the science test, and I won't have to be valedictorian, and I won't have to get up and make a speech in front of everybody." But this really somehow sets Elizabeth on edge. She feels like it's a form of cheating. At one point, when she finds him throwing out a bunch of things from his room, including his science notes. And he says, well, if I wanted to pass that science test, I already know everything that's in the notes. I don't need the notes, but he hasn't yet decided. And she really takes him to task and says that not putting the correct answers down is in itself a form of cheating, and that he's cheating himself as well. So she's annoyed with him. The subplot in this episode deals with the boys and the war overseas. John Boy's back, and he tells Daddy that he has asked to be reassigned overseas in terms of working for the Stars and Stripes. And John's a little surprised with everything he's gone through, but John Boy just feels like that's where he needs to be. And then Ben comes home on leave, and in a beautiful scene between Eric and Leslie Winston as Cindy, he tells Cindy that they are being shipped out the next day, and he doesn't quite know where, but someplace overseas and, in the Pacific. So this is when, he's going to get shipped over into the Pacific. And then Jason, of course, is about to be, his unit and his training and, what's going on, that he's going to be getting sent overseas as well as the war is escalating. We see a couple of scenes of the family gathered around the radio, and initially they find out what's going on over there, and that it looks like the tide is turning in Europe, and that they're doing well, and it's kind of coming into the final push to wrap up, particularly the war in Europe. And so everyone's really paying close attention to what's happening there. Elizabeth and Drew are supposed to be going to the final dance. It's not their graduation, but there's going to be a graduation dance, and all the students get to go. And so they're all set to go to that. And one day when Drew and Elizabeth are walking to school, home from school, not sure which, Drew talks about the war and how he kind of hopes it continues long enough so that he can sign up and go over and fight, because he wants to go fight the Germans. And Elizabeth is, again, very upset with him now, because she says that, well, Mary Ellen lost her husband and her brothers are over there. John Boy was shot down. And why on earth would Drew wish for the war to continue? And so she's kind of like, all right, no, forget it. And she walks off. Drew's upset. Elizabeth's upset. And we understand that and how tough it is. Having found out that the U.S. has now reached France, and so they're engaged there to try and free France. And then another time when they're listening to the radio, we really get the sense, John gets the sense that things are nearing sort of an ultimate point over there. And after he turns off the radio broadcast where the announcer has basically, said that they're all, praying for what's happening over there and for all the men and the young men who are fighting. And afterwards, when John turns off the radio, he says he feels like he wants to go cut wood. And he leaves, and then both John Boy and Jason follow, and then Ben and Jim Bob follow as well. And it's just left, you see a shot of Cindy, Aaron, and Mary Ellen. And Mary Ellen basically says, and what about the women? What do we do? And Aaron says, we wait. So it's just that sense of that they feel like they are somewhat helpless in terms of anything really practical that they are doing to bring the war to a close and to impact what's happening to the important men in their life. Coming home from pickets one day, Mary Ellen and Aaron arrive, and this was another case of things I've talked about with the intercutting of exterior sets and interior sets, because you see Rose has been on the front porch, and then that is on the soundstage, the interior set of the front porch, because you can see into the house and you see the fireplace is there, and it's just, I can tell it was on the soundstage. And then you see Mary Ellen and Aaron drive up and park in the front yard. Well, that would have been shot on the back lot. And then we cut back to, as Aaron and Mary Ellen are coming towards the front porch, it cuts back to Rose just standing on the front porch, but you don't see the broader shot to see joining Aaron and Mary Ellen moving all the way to the stairs. And you just then see Aaron and Mary Ellen come up past Rose. So that was one of those cases I talked about where on the soundstage, there was only one sort of short step up onto the porch as opposed to the 3 or 4 that we had. I think we had 3 outside. So when we came in, we needed, with the final step up, to give the illusion that we were really kind of coming upstairs. So we would tend to enter shots like that and sort of get shorter and kind of like raise our body up as we came up some of those imaginary steps. So in this case, you just kind of catch the last piece of it. So we didn't have to do a really major adjustment there. But you do see us come onto now the interior porch set. And there's a letter that Rose had gotten from Ike when she was at his store buying a graduation gift for Jim Bob. And she hands the letter to Aaron. It's a letter from Ashley, and Aaron has talked about how she's been writing to Ashley, but she hasn't heard back from him in ages. Well, this letter basically shares that Ashley has gotten married to an English woman that he met while in England. And, just sort of says how sorry he is to Aaron, but that, yes, it was fast, but Aaron was so far away. And so Aaron, of course, is absolutely devastated by this because it's been out of her control. So she's now trying to deal with that heartache. A really nice scene between Aaron and John Boy outside Pickett's where they're sort of sharing lunch and they talk about how, they haven't done this for a while. And John Boy says he understands how hurt Aaron is and that, she needs to experience those feelings and not just try and lock them all up. And she doesn't really want to think about it. She wants to pretend it hasn't happened. And John Boy basically says, he's rusty in his big brother skills, but he's going to try and be of some help to her here, and talks about how in her own way, she is a casualty of war, that what happened to her with Ashley was because of the war. And so that there are a lot of ways in which one can be a casualty. So I guess this would also mean to say that Mary Ellen was a casualty of war in losing Kurt, and John Boy, of course, from his injury. So Cindy will be in having to wait at home with Ginny, who's so young, and waiting to try and find out what's happening with Ben and is he safe. So I just thought it was a very poignant scene. I also noted in this scene with Aaron and John Boy that I have been starting to point out when some of our stand-ins served as small cameo roles or as background players, and in this case, the gentleman that you see sitting on the bench behind, off to the side from where Aaron and John Boy are, is one of our stand-ins, Gordon Hodges, who was a longtime stand-in on the show and often appeared in some of these little scenes and stuff. On the day of the science exam, at first, Elizabeth comes and Jim Bob's not there. And she says, he's hiding in his room, And Corabeth is sort of like, well, we can't wait any longer. And so she starts the test and Jim Bob comes in, but Elizabeth isn't quite sure what he's going to do with this test. Is he going to take it honestly, or is he going to intentionally put down the wrong answers? Afterwards, Corabeth is making the announcement. She's gone over the test results and everybody did really well. And one person got 100%, and that was Jim Bob. So she's happy to say that he is going to be the valedictorian. So then she shares her information and all her plans for the graduation, that they're going to put these paper flowers on this trellis they're going to walk through. And then she's going to sing a song. And then she has outlined notes for Jim Bob for his speech to say, to learn. And then Jim Bob sort of says, no, I'm not going to say this, and she's like, well, all you have to do is read. And he says, no, if I'm going to speak, I'm going to say what I want to say. And I also, I think that your plans for the graduation it's not what we want. It's stupid. It's silly. I'm not going to walk through some arch with, tacky paper flowers. And he figures the only graduation that he will be part of, and he wants it to be special and memorable. And so he feels like if the graduating class gets together, that they can plan something really memorable. So Corabeth's a little taken aback and, offended by this, but he says, that they're going to have a meeting after school and that she can come if she wants to. So I love that he's just very matter of fact about it. He doesn't go on the attack with her. He just says it very simply in the beautiful way that David had of just being so honest with his delivery of what he had to say. It's graduation day, and Jim Bob, nobody knows where he is. Rose gets a call. It's Corabeth, and, it sounds like the graduating class is sort of missing. And then Jim Bob does come back in, and Rose gives him the gift. They're these cufflinks that Ike made her a deal on. And so she gives those to Jim Bob, and that's, just a nice moment between the two of them. And then we're at the graduation. Right before graduation, Roland Piper, this other student, comes to Godsey's store, and Corabeth, is sort of talking about how she doesn't think that she would come back as a teacher. And, Ike is saying, yeah, they treated you badly. Why would you want to come back? She says, well, if they really needed me. But she feels like they didn't appreciate her. And Roland Piper comes in, and he has a gift for her from the graduating class and basically says that she was the best substitute teacher they had. So that really touches Corabeth. The graduation seems to be set up right by Drusilla's pond. So they would have erected this stage, and, they had used that sort of area before for different things. The graduating class comes in, and just as Jim Bob is about to speak, Daddy pulls up, and he has brought Grandma. And so Ellen Corby appears in this episode to be there to see Jim Bob graduate. And Jim Bob gives a really short, simple speech, but just talks about how they all wanted to do something important to help the community, and what they feel like they wanted to do was all the boys from the graduating class got together and went into town, and they all enlisted. and that the girls went along to be of support to them. And so they're all going to go off and serve to help, keep their community free, basically, that's something that they wanted to do. The final part of the episode is just, it's so heartbreaking to me. The boys they're all leaving that morning, and Jim Bob gives Grandma his picture from graduation, his graduation picture. And, she goes by and puts it on the mantle along with all of the other, all the boys and that are in uniform. He says, I'll get you one in uniform once I have my uniform. And then we're out on the front porch, and John Boy drives up in Jim Bob's car. He's been talking about how he's trying to figure out what color he's going to paint it. And at one point, Elizabeth says yellow. And because she's saying he's a coward for not committing to taking the science test. So John Boy drives up with Jim Bob's car, and it's now painted yellow. And Jim Bob hands the keys over to Elizabeth to use the car while he is away. And then the boys all hug Daddy goodbye, and we see them all three of them in uniform, and Jim Bob, about to be in uniform. And so it's a fitting and very poignant ending to season 8, as all of the Walton men are now heading off to war and who knows what. And the family, Daddy and the girls and Rose, we're all left there to wait, as was so often the case, particularly at that point. Yes, women served in different ways, but mostly women were home waiting and taking up the jobs to cover what needed to be done while the men were at war. In this episode, we had quite a few of our regular recurring characters, Joe and Ronnie Claire back as Ike and Corabeth, Peggy Ray back as Rose, Leslie Winston as Cindy, Ben's wife, Martha Nix and Keith Mitchell Coogan as Jeffrey and Serena, the Reed twins, Michael and Marshall, back as John Curtis, the babies that played Ginny, those twins, now at this point they were just infants and they weren't credited, so I don't know who they were at this point in the series. Tony Becker back as Drew, and then Robert Wightman back as John Boy. Our guest actors were, as Roland Piper, Gary Imhoff. And Gary has quite a career of credentials. He was, amongst other things, the speaking and singing voice of Thumbelina, of the prince in Thumbelina, that animated movie. He did a lot of voice work. He was in the Spider-Man animated series. He also was in 8 episodes of Falcon Crest as Curtis Estabrook. 5 episodes of 8 is Enough. He was in Barney Miller, Taxi, How the West Was Won, and he also taught acting for years. Now, I have known Gary forever. I don't think I knew him before he was on the Waltons, but after that point, we ended up working together a few times. We worked on an industrial film together, and then we also did a musical presentation, a couple of those relative to a musical that I was involved in the development and writing of with the composer, who was a very good friend of mine. And so we had the chance to be engaged in that. Gary has an absolutely stunning singing voice. If you ever have a chance to catch him in as the Prince in Thumbelina or any of the other singing things he's done. And we did do a little trio together, Gary and I and another singer, for the composer that had written that musical, also did a concert of her other music. And so we sang a piece, a trio together. So longtime friend. And if I get a chance, maybe I'll see if Gary can pop on and share a little bit at some point in the future. And then Eric Stoltz was senior boy number 1. So this was clearly the very early in his career, because his career took off, and he went on to do a number of notable films, including Jerry Maguire, Little Women, Pulp Fiction, Memphis Belle, Some Kind of Wonderful, Mask, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. And then in TV, he also served as a producer and director. He was a producer and director as well as an actor on the series Madam Secretary, and he also directed 3 episodes of Glee. He was in the series Bull. He was a director on Grey's Anatomy, He did episodes of Will and Grace, Chicago Hope. He did 24 episodes as Dr. Robert Yeats. Mad About You, he did 6 episodes as Alan Tofsky. He was in The Fall Guy, Knots Landing, 8 is Enough. And whenever I notice an actor who has red hair and is around the age of some of the Walton children, I always wonder, Eric with his red hair, if he ever auditioned originally for one of the kids in The Homecoming. So if I ever come across him, I maybe will ask him that question. And then we had these various different seniors, and they were all credited, even though some of them didn't necessarily say much or say anything. So Susan McClung was senior girl number 1, and in TV, she had a few credits. She did T.J. Hooker, Lou Grant, Knots Landing. Richard Lasting was senior boy number 2. He did in TV Quincy, Facts of Life, was in the movie A Few Good Men. And Marty Post was senior girl number 2. She did episodes of Lou Grant, Fame, and Chicago Hope. And then there was the Walker Edmonston, who was the radio announcer. And he was born in 1926 in St. Louis, Missouri, and died in 2007. He did just a ton of voice work and radio announcer work. He was in the movie Transformer. He did voiceover work in those, The Great Mouse Detective, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Escape from the Planet of the Apes. In that, he was uncredited as the voice of the talking baby chimp. In TV, he did Spider-Man, the animated series, Space Cats, The Transformers, Alvin and the Chipmunks, The Smurfs. As an actor, he did episodes of Dallas, Falcon Crest, Dukes of Hazzard, Heart to Heart, Little House Chips, Barnaby Jones, Fantasy Island, Bob Newhart Show, Mary Tyler Moore Show, Adam 12, Gunsmoke, Mission Impossible, Bonanza, Wild Wild West, Get Smart. So you get the sense he had a huge resume of work that he did. And he did 6 episodes of The Waltons. He was in season 4's The Abdication as the radio announcer voice. In seasons 5, The Hiding Place, he was again on the radio. It's FDR and Edward R. Morrow's voice. Episode 3 in season 6, The Recluse, he was the farmer. And this would have been the only time we actually saw him. Seen in season 7, Day of Infamy, he was the announcer voice. And then season 8, this one, The Valediction, as the radio announcer. And then in season 9's The Last 10 Days, he was radio announcer number 1. And of course, I rarely mention Earl Hamner, who is present in every single episode. So tribute to Earl Hamner as well. Thank you for joining me for this segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. I'll be back with more about episodes, more questions about Ask Judy, a special upcoming holiday series I'm going to do as we get into the holidays and stuff, which will cover various different sorts of things. So I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.